Hello, Steve White, Steve RC9. Well, the latest issue of Star Trek Defiant, number 18, has Spock being imprisoned by Sailor, and it's kind of interesting, but I must admit, I am getting the two titles confused. There is actually a separate Star Trek title, but it doesn't really represent Star Trek. It's very much an alternative version of Star Trek, and it really should have its own subtitle like Star Trek Defiant. And I am finding they're interchangeable and I'm getting them confused. I've talked about a couple of different ones, and when I've been talking about Star Trek, I've also been referring to Defiant as well, because I'm finding them harder and harder to distinguish between the two of them. Because they're basically just not focused around Starfleet and Star Trek values and the utopian vision Gene Roddenberry had. They're very negative and dark, and they focus very much on rebel sort of crews and basically Star Wars type characters and scenarios, and I can't really call them institutions because, rebellions and so forth, grassroots stuff, underground stuff. It's not really, not really established in institutions. But yeah, so it's a bit of a mess, and the art is interesting though. I mean, there's a few pictures in there. It looks good. But yeah, I mean, what do we do with something like this? It's just people who don't know Star Trek, don't like Star Trek, making Star Trek content for people who don't know and don't like Star Trek, because there's more of them than there are fans. And this is a problem that we've had in recent years, that people are really going for the general audience and making Star Trek into very much generic science fiction, and not sort of adhering to or utilizing or celebrating the things that made Star Trek unique and special, and they're just sort of making very basic generic sci-fi. And the comics sadly are no different. They used to have Star Trek Next Generation comics and Star Trek Original Series comics, and they had ones from the JJ films, which I quite liked. I have like almost all of them. But yeah, now they've just done, well, let's just make a mishmash of characters from all the other series, put them in the current sort of time, which is sort of like 20 years from the end of Nemesis and sort of Voyager, that sort of era, because that era kind of follows us, and because the actors are all age, we sort of look at that as like a contemporary, like a version of like our timeline. So that seems to be where they always land, and just making it just unrecognizable as Star Trek, and that's why I keep getting the two confused. So I'm just acknowledging that, because I realise in a few videos I've done where I've been talking about either one comic or the other, I've launched into tirades about the other comics, because the direction the Star Trek comics are going in is just that direction of treating it Star Trek like Star Wars, having a rebellion, having a ragtag group of people who don't fit into Starfleet, and don't want to go by the books and don't want to follow the regulations or do what represents Star Trek and Starfleet, and they just want to be like contemporary terrorists in our day, and just sort of attacking Starfleet values and Star Trek fans. And it's just like focusing on gods, and not treating them like the aliens of science fiction that Gene Roddenberry did. Just focusing on the mirror universe, which is another thing they've been really preoccupied with, because it's the anti-Star Trek, and apparently it's more popular than actual Star Trek because it takes imagination and being able to really engage in like Star Trek and share that vision, and that's not something for small-minded people. It's for people who can look at the future with some hope and actually see the positive in everything and move towards that, instead of just being caught up in the cynicism and the hate and the negativity and all that of today. So yeah, it's a mess, and I just want to acknowledge that, because not that I have a huge audience or anything, but I just am aware that I've been confusing the two titles and referring to them interchangeably, and I just want to acknowledge that I know I'm doing that, because I feel like they're just the same thing at the moment. And that's a pity, because if you've got two Star Trek titles, they should be very different. You could have one that's very much the generic sci-fi Star Wars version of Star Trek, or the dissidents and people who are unhappy with Star Trek, Starfleet, could be off on their own, sort of trying to do their own thing, and that could maybe be done in a valid way. But if you're going to have another title that's just called Star Trek, it needs to actually represent Star Trek. It needs to be set on, a Starfleet vessel with Starfleet values, and that utopian vision that Gene created, that so many fans believe in, and dream of and hope for, that should actually be what's reflected and what's shown in that comic, and we're getting the absolute opposite. So yeah, I was sort of happy when IDW got the license again for a few more years, and then I wasn't, because I'm like, they've gone in the wrong direction with Star Trek anyway. So had it ended and someone else take Star Trek on, they would have probably started producing Star Trek comics, because they want to sell Star Trek comics to Star Trek fans and collectors. Like I have a whole bunch, and I was collecting them, but I've stopped in the last few years because since I finished off year 5, there's really been nothing that resembles Star Trek coming from them. So I haven't bought any of the new titles in the last few years. And I normally would buy the trades. I wouldn't do the monthly comics. I do the trades, but I haven't been doing that for years. So we'll see what happens.